ice. He claimed he could see vegetation stuck between the teeth. Looking closely at the body, he could see the pores and sebaceous sweat and body fluids coming out. There was blood present around the body, and he could even see the sheds of what looked like ectoparasites on the skin. So like little insects and things that had been on there. So to him, he was like, this is, I don't know what it is, but it's organic, it's real. Well, he was just a student and herpetologist, so he's not really, doesn't know a lot about anthropology and other zoology, but he felt that it was important that other scientists come look at this thing. So he made a valiant attempt through 1967 to try to get different scientists to come look at this thing. And this involved, in fact, going to the anthropology department at the University of Minnesota, where my dad was on the staff. By the way, there was another anthropologist on the staff there at the time named Dr. Grover Krantz, who some of you may have heard of if you're into Bigfoot. But this extended into 1968, and eventually, I'm getting my times all mixed up. So this is 67 is when it was, but yeah, he started to see it in 67. He would catch it periodically as it came around to Milwaukee or other places in the Midwest. And again, he was trying to get someone to go look at this thing because he thought it was scientifically important, but no one would listen to him. So this culminated with him finally reaching out to, on December 12th, he had seen it at the Chicago Livestock Exposition just a few days before in December of that month. He went and contacted by phone a guy named Ivan T. Sanderson. You guys familiar with Ivan Sanderson, one of the founding fathers of cryptozoology? At the time, Sanderson was living in New Jersey and was running something called the SITU, the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained, where he investigated things like Bigfoot, and he was also getting into UFOs and other things, had a whole staff working under it with him. And he wrote a seminal book in the 1960s called Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, which is one of the, what we call one of the Bibles of Bigfoot, alongside John Green's Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us. Very important book. So Cullen reached out to Sanderson on December 12th and said, by phone, and said, hey, you got to come up with this thing. This could be a real abominable snowman. And at that time, Sanderson said, so now we're in December 12th, 1968, Sanderson said, okay, well, normally I don't do this, but it just so happens I have a house guest with me at the moment, and his name is Bernard Heuvelmans, the founding father of cryptozoology. So you have the two fathers of cryptozoology in New Jersey on December 12th, 1968. Heuvelmans had never been to the States before, and they decided, you know what, road trip. Let's drive out to Minnesota and see this thing for ourselves. It's probably a fake, but who knows? This guy, Terry Collins, seems pretty obsessed with it. He's a knowledgeable guy. So they left on December 14th, 1968. They drove out to Altura, Minnesota from New Jersey. They arrived there on December 16th, called Frank Hansen by phone, and he invited them over to his property. Now, at this time, it was the winter, and so the exhibit was, it was off exhibit. It wasn't touring. So Hansen had a ranch, and he had this tractor trailer parked in his property. So Heuvelmans and Sanderson headed over to the property, went in and looked at the exhibit. And here they are examining it. They ultimately examined the exhibit for 2 solid days. And the more they looked at it, both of these, and kids, keep in mind, these are both trained zoologists, okay? These are guys that have, Heuvelmans is a PhD. He's the head of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. Sanderson is a lifelong animal collector, zoologist, and TV personality. So they examined it. Here's Heuvelmans and here's Sanderson examining it in very cramped quarters in this tractor trailer. They became convinced it was real, that this was not a carnival gaff, that it was a real specimen of something they were looking at. They took a lot of measurements. They took photographs. Heuvelmans had a really good 35 millimeter camera, but they had trouble getting good photos because it was so cramped. They had to do it in sections, right? They kind of disagreed in terms of what they thought it was, but this is an important thing too. So when they first talked to Frank Hansen about it, they asked him, Hansen said, well, I don't want any publicity. You guys can examine this thing, but I don't want your conclusions to be out there or anything. And Sanderson agreed to this, but Heuvelmans didn't. And Heuvelmans later came back with a very famous quote, which is, I am a scientist first and a gentleman second. So he was going to put science above everything else. So they examined the Iceman for 2 days. They could smell the decaying flesh, which is one of the things that convinced them. In fact, at one point, they put a bright light on top of the glass to get a better picture, and it cracked the glass. And then they could really smell rotting flesh coming up through the ice. So they said, this thing is rotting. It's real. Let's talk about the morphology of the Iceman and what they both concluded in terms of what. Now, they also asked Hansen, do you own this thing? And he told them, well, I'm not the actual owner. I'm just exhibiting it. It belongs to a mysterious California millionaire who's in the film industry, and I can't disclose his name. I'm under oath. But he owns the property, so I'm not allowed to give it away. Or they offered to buy it at some point. They said, we can raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy this from you. He said, no, the owner will not allow that. He doesn't want to sell it. They asked him if he'd taken any samples, because it was under ice. He wouldn't melt it or thaw it out for them, right? So they had to examine it through opaque, thick ice that was very cloudy. And so they asked him, well, can we have flesh samples? He said, well, we've already taken flesh and hair samples, and they've been sent to the very best experts. Well, who? Well, they're just top experts. They've been examining the flesh and the hair. Sorry if I'm screwing up the video here. I guess I'm moving around a lot. Okay, here are some images. These are photographs. This is a composite photograph of the Iceman. As you can see, it's got its left arm is kind of laying above its head like this. Right hand is right there on the, here's a sketch that Ivan Sanderson did based on Heuvelmans' photographs. And then here is another Sanderson sketch based on his original diagram with all the measurements. The Iceman was 6 feet tall. They estimated it weighed about 250 pounds. It was very powerfully built with a barrel chest and no neck. It was covered in hair that's about 3 inches long, except for the bottoms of the feet, parts of the hand and the face. It had incredibly large hands. The hands were the most outstanding thing. These hands were about 11 inches long and 7 inches wide. The hands featured a poorly opposed thumb that was very long and tapered at the end. Very unusual for a hominid. And the feet were very big, square, about 10 inches wide. At the toes, 10 inches long. It appeared to be, its eyes were both missing, and one eye appeared to be laying on its cheek. There was blood around its head, and also an apparent fracture in the top of its arm where the bone was protruding. So there was blood all around here. Had male genitalia. The face was kind of unusual. Had kind of a pug nose sticking up like this with facing nostrils. It did not have really a receding forehead, which is what we hear, right, in terms of things like Bigfoot and other primitive hominids, which indicates a reduced brain size, you know. So it had kind of no prognathism, in other words, a flat face. Kind of a bit of a mustache. So it's weird, kind of similar to a Bigfoot, but not exactly, I guess. Here are 3 more sketches of the Iceman. This one was done by Bernard Heuvelmans. This one was done by an artist named John Schoher. And this one was done by an artist named Alika Lindberg. And Alika Lindberg was the granddaughter or step-granddaughter of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. And she was also Bernard Heuvelmans' ex-wife. So remember, Charles Lindbergh is the first famous American we're going to mention in this presentation, but there's going to be a whole bunch that get drawn into this thing. This is what the Iceman would have looked like alive, right? That was kind of a... Okay. Here are some sketches of the face, again by Alika Lindbergh. At the commission of her ex-husband, Bernard Heuvelmans, they remained friends throughout their lives. Even though Alika remarried Charles Lindbergh's grandson, she was still Bernard's good friend. They're interesting. No The filtrum is the little line we have here between our nose and our upper lips. It's a vestigial trait. In other words, if you look at your dog, you know how it's got the little division in the middle of its nose. There is an evolutionary adaptation for that. In humans, it's just kind of a thing that we have, but this particular specimen did not play any kind of filtrum. And again, the eyes were missing. So the obvious supposition by Heuvelmans and Sanderson was, since the eyes were missing, one was on the cheek, the arm was broken, was this thing has been shot. Somebody shot it through the eye, blew out its head, blew the other eye out, maybe shot it in the arm while it was defending itself. So the obvious assumption now is that, okay, this thing has not been dead thousands of years, right? It wasn't dug out of the ice. It was something that's been dead, was killed in recent years. Now, Hansen had many different stories as to the origin of the Iceman, because the obvious question would be, where did you get this thing, right? The original story that he told Heuvelmans and Sanderson was that it was found floating in the Siberian Sea by Russian sealers in a 6,000-pound block of ice. And they fished it out of the ocean, and it was in a 6,000-pound block of ice, and then it ended up in Hong Kong somehow, where it was purchased by this mysterious Californian millionaire who saw it at this warehouse when he was touring Asia. Later, Hansen's story changed. It was no longer Russian sealers, it was Japanese whalers. And then it eventually became Chinese fishermen. So the story was always shifting and changing on Hansen's part as far as the origin of where this thing was found. But obviously, based on the apparent bullet wounds, it had not been frozen for thousands of years. And guys, you should also know that even the coldest temperatures on planet Earth would not preserve a specimen for that era of time. Well, you may bring up like the woolly mammoths and some of the other Pleistocene mammals that have been dug out of the Siberian tundra and places in Alaska. They're not actually frozen in ice. Those are sunken in frozen mud. And a lot of that preservative is something called tannic acid that like preserves the flesh. So when you've seen these mammoths and ancient wolves and bears and things that have been pulled out of the frozen tundra, they're not frozen in a solid thing of ice. So there's no temperature on Earth that would preserve something like this for tens of thousands of years, if that makes sense. So that was kind of a non-starter as well. Okay, more sketches here of the face and the foot. Now this is key in terms of identifying a hominin, a great ape. We're looking at the hallux, or the big toe, is perfectly aligned with the other toes. And the toes are all about the same. But that is a key diagnostic thing, because obviously in our species, Homo sapiens, the hallux is aligned with the other toes because we walk upright and bipedally. In other hominins, it's an opposed hallux because of grasping and climbing. You know, we're talking about brachiators like gorillas and monkeys and things like that. So in terms of a taxonomic description, this would indicate that this thing, whatever it was more human-like or walked upright as opposed to being something that climbed up in trees. And again, very large feet. Now, again, the most remarkable feature are the hands, which again were massive and bulky compared to the rest of the body. But what's important is that, you know, you have these kind of long fingers. They said that it had kind of not claws, it had chiseled kind of coppery colored fingernails. But look at the thumb and the length of the thumb compared to the index finger. This is a very unexpected adaptation for any type of hominid. You wouldn't expect to see a thumb like that. So again, think about it in terms of our thumb and the way that it's opposed, so that we've evolved to grasp and eventually build things, including this microphone or whatever. You know, in other hominins, the thumb is often placed very low compared to the other fingers. But this thumb was very long and actually tapered at a point. So that was a kind of a weird design for a hand, something that has never been found in the fossil record in terms of hominin evolution. Okay, so again, we're talking about December 1968. Heuvelmans and Sanderson examined this thing. They left Hansen's farm pretty excited because they thought this is the find of the century. We have discovered some type of ancient man-like creature. We've got to get a hold of this thing. Hansen's not going to give it to us. He's telling us the millionaire won't sell it. So what are we going to do? So Hansen and Heuvelmans and Sanderson devised a plan that involved getting law enforcement involved, getting other scientists involved, including the Smithsonian Institute, in order to put enough pressure on Frank Hansen to basically give up this specimen for better scientific evaluation. That was their plan. Even though Sanderson had promised Heuvelmans they would not publicize it. But in fact, in December 25th, Christmas, of 1968, just a few days after they examined it, Sanderson went on the Johnny Carson show where he was a regular guest. He was kind of like, back in the day, he was like Jeff Corwin or Mark Fowler, you know, the guys that would come on the Johnny Carson show with different animals. And Johnny Carson was not the host that night because it was Christmas, but it was actually a guest host named Jack Jones, who, interesting trivia here, he is the singer of the Love Boat theme song, if you guys remember Love Boat. He was hosting the Tonight Show that night, and Ivan Sanderson was his guest. He came on and said, basically announced to the world, we have discovered something like Bigfoot. We have a body now. So that was kind of a tease, right? So that happened in December of 1968, right at the end of the year. So even though they had agreed to Sanderson not to publicize it, Heuvelmans got to work right away writing a scientific paper on the Iceman. And his plan, because he was the head of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Europe, he decided that he was going to publish a scientific paper describing the Iceman. And ultimately that was published on February 10th, 1969. And this came as a shock, of course, to the whole world. Now you have a scientist writing a paper saying that some type of primitive, hair-covered, man-like creature has been discovered, frozen in a block of ice, and strangely, it's been on tour at carnivals and fairs all across the United States. So this came out on February 10th. About that same time period, Ivan Sanderson reached out to the head of the Smithsonian Institute, a guy named S. Dillon Ripley, who he knew, and said, hey, the Smithsonian Institute needs to get a hold of this specimen. This is groundbreaking. This is the discovery of the century, this frozen hominin. And at the time, that the head primatologist at the Smithsonian was a guy named Dr. John Napier. Does anyone have his book on Bigfoot? He's got one of the, in the early 1970s, he published a very good kind of skeptical book on Bigfoot. But still, he was a scientist and was very interested in this. So they contacted the Smithsonian and said, okay, let's get the Smithsonian involved. The Smithsonian then reached out to the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and said, okay, let's get the FBI involved because this thing looks human-like and it's been shot. So maybe we can use law enforcement to put some pressure on Hansen and we'll get it that way. So this was all kind of coming down on Hansen at once. And obviously Hansen found out about what was going on and got very nervous. In fact, in late February, the local sheriff, George Fort, came out to his property and said, Frank, we got to look at this thing. People are saying the FBI is going to get involved, and I need to find out what you got going on here. And Fort claimed that he went in and looked at the specimen, and he couldn't tell what it was. He didn't have any experience with this thing. He just said it looked like a big ape or something, so he left the property and didn't take any action. And then on February 20th, Frank Hansen called Ivan Sanderson. At this point, Hansen had didn't want anything to do with Heuvelmans, but he was still maintaining a relationship with Ivan. Called Ivan up and said, well, the actual owner of the Iceman has taken the specimen back. So I no longer have it in my possession. He's nervous about all this stuff that's going on with the FBI and the Smithsonian and the local police. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a fabricated Iceman now constructed, and I'll go back on display. So I will no longer have the actual Iceman, but I'm going to have a dummy, basically, that I'm going to go on display with. Kind of a bait and switch, right? It's got this original specimen. These are photographs of the later version of the Iceman. Okay, so on April 21st, 1969, Hansen had a press conference on his farm in Altura, Minnesota, and announced to the media that I have a new version of the Minnesota Iceman. It is not real. It is a latex dummy. I've had it built for me or commissioned in California, and I will now be touring with this. The original specimen is no longer on display at the behest of the owner, who I can't name. Getting pretty convoluted, right? These are some photographs taken right after the new version of the Iceman went on display. These photos were taken by a cryptozoologist named Mark A. Hall in the early part of 1969. There were several people. Terry Cullen went back and looked at the new version and said, no, that's not the same thing that I saw. This is completely different. Ivan Sanderson had different agents across the U.S., including in Chicago. They went and looked at the new exhibit. And what they figured out was there were at least 11 distinct differences that could be documented between the new version of the Minnesota Iceman that Hansen was now touring with and the original version that had been studied by Heuvelmans, Sanderson, and Terry Cullen. So 11 differences, even though those aren't widely publicized, right? Now you can see the original, when they looked at the mouth of the original Iceman, its mouth was almost completely closed and it only had 2 teeth showing. A reduced canine tooth, which would again be considered more of a modern or derived characteristic as opposed to a primitive characteristic. You know how gorillas have those really big canine teeth, monkeys do too. Humans, we have reduced canines, so that's more of a derived characteristic. Yeah, some photographs that were taken of the second version of the Iceman, the one that was on tour after April 1969. Here's a photograph of the hand again. You can see those long fingers and long thumb. Here's a photograph of the second Iceman, or the second version. You can see the teeth are all showing now. We see a bunch of big square teeth there. I put it up as a little comparison here to the head of the Patty. We all know Patty, right? So just to kind of see if there are any kind of similarities or whatever. But you can see Patty has more hair on her lower face, more receding cranium, the famous sagittal crest and stuff. So I don't know. This thing doesn't seem to resemble a Bigfoot in the traditional sense. Okay, so Hansen's on tour with, now this is not the Iceman. Hansen's on tour with the Iceman for the better part of 1969. In July of 1969, he's trying to bring it back across the border from Canada. He'd gone into Canada to put it on display at some carnivals up there, and it was seized by the American Customs. And they said, oh, wait, hold on. This thing looks like a body. We can't let you just bring this back into the country. It's got bullet wounds or whatever. So Hansen panicked, and he called Ivan Sanderson and said, what do I do? They seized the Iceman. And Sanderson said, well, give him a sample. Let him take a flesh sample. Oh, no, the owner will never allow that. That will destroy the exhibit. Well, why don't they x-ray it? If it's a latex dummy, there's no bones, right? So they'll do an x-ray of it, and it'll just be like, oh, no, the owner will never allow an x-ray either. So I'm still at the behest of this mysterious California millionaire. Well, it turns out that Frank Hansen, contributor in his state of Minnesota to a U.S. congressman named Walter Mondale, who's kind of who he knew. So future Vice President Walter Mondale contacted the Customs Department, Agriculture Department, and allowed them, or commanded them, or persuaded them maybe, to release the Iceman back to Frank Hansen. Okay, so we now have Charles Lindbergh, J. Edgar Hoover, and Walter Mondale, right? We get some pretty famous people getting involved or wrapped up in this particular case. Okay, so things went on for a while, as is, let me make sure not, there's so many different beats that we have to hit on this particular story. Oh, we need to go back to Argosy magazine, don't we? Did I have a slide of that? So I mentioned that Bernard Heuvelmans published an article in February of 1969, but Ivan Sanderson in May of 1969 published an article for Argosy magazine, which he was the editor of at that time. Does anybody remember Argosy? It's kind of a cool magazine back in the day. So this is the actual issue, May 1969. This is actually Bigfoot Collectors. This is a highly sought after. If you ever find a copy of this magazine, it goes for a few $100. It's very hard to find. But this is where Sanderson told his version of the story. Now, it should be pointed out that they had Heuvelmans and Sanderson had two very different opinions about what the Iceman might be, okay? They examined it together and separately over a 2-day period in December of 1958. Hoogelmans actually gave it a scientific name. He called it Homo pongoides, which means ape-like man, which is kind of a tumultuous thing for a scientist to name or describe a specimen that can't even be examined by scientists, right? But Hoogelmans was of the opinion that the Iceman was a living Neanderthal. And he based this on the research of a Russian hominologist named Boris Porshnev, who, if you guys have heard of the Almas or Almasti in Russia and Mongolia, they seem to be different than Bigfoot. They're more like man-sized, hair-colored creatures that have like a primitive language and may have tool use. And so the Russian hominologists like Boris Porshnev and Dmitry Bayanov and some of those guys theorized that there were living Neanderthal men in remote parts of Asia. And that explained the Almasti and Almas. And if you guys have also heard of like the Kaptar, the Dev, and some of these other Russian hominids. But this thing doesn't really look like a Neanderthal man in terms of what we knew about Neanderthals. They probably weren't that hairy and stuff. Now, Sanderson didn't agree with that. He said, well, yeah, I don't think it's a Neanderthal man. It's something else. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's definitely not a Neanderthal. So I'm going to separate myself from my buddy Bernard on that particular point. Meanwhile, back at the Smithsonian, they had contacted J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, and they made a couple of calls and found out that there was a guy in California that had built a rubber version of the Iceman for Frank Hansen. And the timelines are a little bit blurry, but based on this information, the Smithsonian backed out before they got pulled into some kind of ridiculous farce and said, okay, we're no longer interested in this. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI decided the same thing. We're not going to get involved in this. We don't really have any evidence that there's been any type of crime committed here. So we're not going to investigate it either. And I've had some people online that have talked about the Iceman have suggested that, oh no, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were involved or did investigate the Minnesota Iceman. But a few years ago, I went on to the Freedom for Information Act, the CIA database, and did a request for any information on the Minnesota Iceman, and there was nothing. So there's no records that I can find that indicate that the FBI was ever actually involved in investigating the Minnesota Iceman. So that's a bit of a myth. All right. So I guess that kind of catches us up to date in terms of what transpired in the early parts of 1969. Now in 1970, Frank Hansen appeared again and wrote an article for Saga magazine. This was in July of 1970. You guys remember Saga, another kind of old school mystery magazine. And in this particular article, written in July of 1970, Hansen changed the story once again. He now claimed, I shot the Minnesota Iceman in northern Minnesota on a hunting trip in 1960. I was up there, I was stationed at an Air Force base, we went hunting in November, and according to the story, he had shot a deer and it ran off, and he followed the blood trail, tracked it, and when he finally cut up to the deer, there were 3 human-like creatures crouched down in front of it, ripping out its entrails and drinking its blood by cupping their hands and scooping their blood into their mouth, which is a pretty far-out story, right, guys? I don't even think in the annals of Bigfoot, we don't really have any stories of Bigfoot cupping blood, and like, I don't know, maybe we do. But anyways, Hansen changed the story once again, that now he had shot this thing in Minnesota, and that's where it came from. And he also put a disclaimer at the end of his article, which basically stated, if I am absolved legally from any potential liability or crime or anything like that, I will release the Iceman to the authorities and they can study the stuff. But I just want a written, thing to get me off the hook. Hansen had good lawyers, I'm sure, at this point, because he was being harassed by the police, the FBI. And you got to imagine, guys, if you've got something that looks human-like and it's got bullet holes in it, and you're charging people money to come look at it, I mean, there's got to be some kind of legal liability, right? I would assume that would put the fear in. Hansen was apparently a very paranoid guy, according to Terry Cullen and Sanderson and other people that dealt with him. He was a character. He changed his story a lot, but he was also a bit of a paranoid person. But anyways, he came out with this story in 1970. A few months earlier, there was another story, an article that ran in another tabloid, and I don't remember exactly which one, where a woman named Helen Westring claimed that she had shot the Minnesota Iceman when she was camping in the woods of Minnesota. This thing had come out and attacked her and molested her, and she managed to grab a gun and shoot it through the eye. So there were now multiple stories about the Iceman having an origin in Minnesota in North America as opposed to Asia. In 1974, Bernard Heuvelmans co-authored a book with Boris Porshnev, the Russian hominologist, and there is an American version, but this is the original French version, La Homme des Néandertals est toujours vivant, which basically means Neanderthal man is still alive. And he featured the Minnesota Iceman in this particular book as a basis of evidence. This is actually a reconstruction of a Homo erectus. I guess it doesn't really, I didn't put a Neanderthal up there, but something similar. But Heuvelmans' book is very interesting. And actually, I have to admit, a little bit disappointing as a cryptozoologist of this generation, because Heuvelmans in his book comes off as a bit brash, and he spends a lot of time criticizing his friend Ivan Sanderson, who sadly passed away in 1972, 2 years before the book was published. And he blamed a lot of things on Ivan, that Ivan fouled everything up. He screwed up the whole process in terms of them trying to get the Iceman specimen, blah, blah, blah. Heuvelmans also had an interesting take in terms of the, quote, second version of the Iceman that supposedly went on tour in April of 1969. Heuvelmans claimed that Hansen didn't actually have a dummy made, but he kept the original Minnesota Iceman on display in plain sight. In other words, there was no switch made, but it was the same Iceman that was still now on tour under ice, which is a pretty weird considering there's so many physiological differences between the two specimens. Furthermore, Heuvelmans came up with a pretty wild theory about the Iceman's origin. He hypothesized that since Frank Hansen was an Air Force pilot in Vietnam, the early parts of the Vietnam War, that the Iceman had actually been shot in Vietnam. It was one of these so-called rock apes that the Vietnam veterans were talking about, these hairy man-like creatures in the jungles of Vietnam, also known locally as the Goi Rung, that's the Vietnamese name for these wild men, and that Hansen had smuggled the body back to the U.S. in a body bag as a deceased soldier. So, I mean, I don't know if that's if you guys have ever heard this particular theory about, Now, what's interesting is that the Minnesota Iceman, of all the mystery hominins that we hear about around the world, it does seem to most closely resemble the Asian versions like the Goi Rung, or in my book, which I've got copies of here on my table, A Menagerie of Mysterious Beasts, I draw a strong parallel to descriptions of the Chinese version of Bigfoot, known as the Gerhard, because there are many eyewitnesses in China who describe that upturned kind of nose and the kind of the same features, facial features that we see in the Minnesota Iceman. So anyways, that was, and again, there's an English version of this book available. I don't have a copy of it with me. I think Lauren Coleman was pivotal, and if you guys know Lauren, was pivotal in bringing this particular book to English, but it is now obtainable. Frank Hansen he still toured around with this Minnesota Iceman exhibit up until 1983. And he went from carnivals and fairs to showing it at shopping malls and car dealerships and places like that. So here's Hansen in 1983 at a shopping mall. And it was around this time period that he finally stopped touring with the Minnesota Iceman exhibit. I think the last exhibition was in Rochester, Minnesota at a car dealership in 1983. So remember, I saw it in 1976. Whenever I talk about the Minnesota Iceman, many people talk about how they saw it back in the day. And I'm just curious, did anyone here see it back in the 70s, 80s? Okay, you saw it? What, do you remember what year? Okay, it was at a Piggly Wiggly. That's funny. So I saw it in 1976, so presumably after the original, long after the original version disappeared. But in 1983, it actually went off exhibit, officially with Frank Hansen. Now, if you guys have ever heard of a TV show called Monster Quest, which I was proud to be involved with, this is the executive producer, Doug Hychek from Minnesota. And Doug has told me that he actually saw the Minnesota Iceman twice when he was living in Minnesota. First, as a young boy about my age, he saw it perhaps at the Minnesota State Fair like I did. And I think we're about the same age. I might be a little older. But he saw it, the first time he saw it as a kid, he thought immediately, this is fake. He said the hairs looked like they were artificially implanted in the body, kind of like a doll. Hychek used his sister's dolls as well. I used to look at my sister's dolls and the way the hair was put in there, and this is what it looked like. So Doug saw it first when he was a kid growing up in Minnesota. But then later in the 1990s, he and his girlfriend at that time, and he's a young man at this point, Doug was motoring across southern Minnesota with his girlfriend, and they saw a sign on the side of the road that said antiques for sale. And so they went to this property, and it was Frank Hansen's property. And while Hansen was talking to his girlfriend, Doug snuck off into the barn looking for antiques, and he saw the Minnesota Iceman exhibit completely out of ice, unfrozen. He said it was just a latex dummy laying in a glass coffin. And he was surprised. Oh, there's that Iceman thing I saw when I was a kid. Yeah, it's fake. Definitely looks fake to me. So Doug Hychek claims that he saw it twice, was never convinced it was real. Now, who was the mysterious owner of the Minnesota Iceman, if such a person actually did exist? In 1994, any guys fans of the show Unsolved Mysteries? In September of 1994, Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack had an episode that featured the Minnesota Iceman and told the whole story. Frank Hansen refused to be a part of it, so he was not interviewed. But they did interview Terry Cullen, two other people that had seen the Minnesota Iceman around the time with Cullen, both gentlemen now scientists. They were all convinced it was real. Cryptozoologist Mark A. Hall appeared. They did a nice recreation of the whole Minnesota Iceman thing, but Hansen did not appear on the show. But it did revive interest in the Minnesota Iceman story. And in 1994, Hansen was called by a Minnesota Bigfoot researcher named Mike Quast, who's still around. Mike interviewed Frank Hansen, and Hansen told him, well, I just recently heard from the original owner of the Minnesota Iceman after all these years. And he still has the Iceman, and he's refusing to show it out to the public, but that's what it is. And he never would reveal who the name of the original owner was. But Mike Quest came up with the theory that maybe it was film legend Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart, you guys know your Bigfoot Yeti history, was pivotal in smuggling out the finger of an alleged Yeti hand known as the Pangboche hand. He was friends with a guy named Tom Slick from my town, San Antonio. And Jimmy Stewart and his wife smuggled out this finger of an alleged Yeti. Peter Byrne was involved. Have you guys ever heard this story? It's pretty fascinating. There was a Yeti hand in a monastery up in the Himalaya. The Buddhist monks would not release the Yeti hand because it was a sacred article. Peter Byrne, who was a Yeti researcher, one of the four horsemen of Bigfoot, right? Peter Byrne passed away this past year, sadly. Went up there in the monastery, got one of the monks drunk, and stole the finger, replaced it with a fake finger, wired it together. And so there's a whole story there. So Jimmy Stewart seemed to have had an interest in the Yeti and things like Bigfoot. Furthermore, Jimmy Stewart was apparently a very religious man. And one of the things Frank Hansen always said was that the original owner of the Minnesota Iceman was a very religious man that did not want to create any type of controversy with the Bible and the theories of creation and stuff. So he put it on display just to gauge people's interest, to see if they would accept other primitive types of humans around in the early times. So Jimmy Stewart was still alive in 1994. So if there was actually a mysterious California millionaire in the film industry who owned the Minnesota Iceman, it might have been him. Another theory that's been put forward is that Howard Hughes, is the famous aviator, was actually a mysterious millionaire. He was kind of an eccentric guy, right? We imagine Howard Hughes owning something like this. But Howard Hughes was passed away before 1994. I think he passed away in the 70s. So he could not have been the original owner. And again, this story may be completely fabricated. We don't know, but okay. So yeah, let me see. There were a lot of things that happened in the early 2000s with regard to the Minnesota Iceman. Now, in 2002, in the early part of 2002, a Bigfoot researcher named Al Berry. You guys are familiar with Ron Moorhead and the Sierra Sounds, the Samurai Chatter. Al Berry was the other researcher that started recording those in the early 70s, a journalist from San Francisco. Al Berry contacted Frank Hansen in early 2002 and interviewed him on the phone. Didn't really give up any new information or whatever, just that he was no longer on tour with the exhibit and so on and so forth. And then in November of 2002, this gentleman named Rick West, who's a fellow Texan, Rick wrote an excellent book called Pickled Punks and Girly Shows. And Rick grew up as a carny. He's a professional carny guy that goes around and displays all types of things at carnivals. And, kind of a sideshow kind of guy. And he wrote this book. He had seen the Minnesota Iceman when he was a kid. I believe it was at the Heart of Illinois State Fair. And when he was a kid, much like Doug Hychek, he came to the conclusion that the Minnesota Iceman was not real, that it was some type of clever gaffe or fabrication that Hansen had put together. And it may have been influential in terms of Rick becoming very active as a carny for years and years. But in November of 2002, he went and visited Frank Hansen on his farm and saw the, once again, obviously it's no longer frozen in a block of ice. It's up here on this platform. And West looked at it. Now, at this time, sadly, Hansen was suffering from dementia, perhaps Alzheimer's, so he was beginning to lose his memory a little bit. And he sadly passed away a few months later, in March of 2003, okay? Took his secret to his grave, allegedly. Now, my good friend Daniel Perez, editor of the Bigfoot Times newsletter. Does anybody get Bigfoot Times? Okay, it's a great publication. I highly recommend it. You can find the website online. Daniel Perez has always given me a hard time about the Minnesota Iceman, which he always calls Bozo. Oh, you and Bozo, talking about that. Bozo's a hoax. He actually published an article on the Minnesota Iceman a few years ago and quoted Rick West and said, well, Rick claimed in his book, Pickled Punks and Girly Shows, that Frank Hansen admitted to him that the whole thing was a hoax and that there never was a real Minnesota Iceman. Well, I contacted Rick and spoke to him, and he seemed like a very cool and gracious guy. And I said, did Hansen admit to you that it was a hoax? And he said, no, he never did. But his memory was failing when I spoke to him at the end of 2002, so he never did tell me it was a hoax, but I think it was a hoax. I said, yeah, I understand, that's what you think. It's starting to look that way, but who knows? So again, Hansen passed away in March of 2003. Now, in 2005, yet another Bigfoot researcher from Minnesota, a guy named Kurt Nelson, decided he was going to go down and investigate the Iceman and try to figure out what was going on. So he drove down to Altura, went into the local bank and asked about Frank Hansen, and they said, oh, he just passed away in 2003, 2 years ago. But his wife, Irene, is still around. So Kurt Nelson called up, went to the phone book, and found Frank Hansen's wife, Irene, and called her up, and said she didn't really want to talk about the Minnesota Iceman, but she did tell him Frank took that secret to his grave. He never even told me what the Minnesota Iceman was. I don't know. So that's interesting, right? And she also told him another interesting thing. She said, Kurt, have you ever heard of a guy named Roger Patterson? He said, yeah. Well, Frank and I went down and visited Roger Patterson and his wife Patricia in the late 1960s. Isn't that interesting, guys? Why would Frank Hansen be interested in meeting Roger Patterson, the guy who filmed the Patterson-Gimlin film? Either you got two of the greatest hoaxers of all time getting together to kind of, high five and, cheers, or maybe Hansen thought that the Minnesota Iceman really was related to Bigfoot in some way and wanted to get more information on Bigfoot and so on and so forth. So that's a nugget that a lot of people don't realize, is that Roger Patterson did meet with Frank Hansen at some point in the late 1960s. Okay, so what happened to the later Minnesota Iceman exhibit? Well, it was sold when Hansen passed away. His family sold it to a local Minnesota haunted house company that rented out different things to haunted houses and theme parks. And there it languished for many years. Here you can see, it's not a very good photo, guys. Again, not frozen, just laying in its coffin. And you can see the face or whatever. Laid there for many years until 2013, when it appeared on eBay. The Minnesota Iceman showed up on eBay as an auction. $20,000 for the asking price. And as it turns out, a friend of mine named Steve Boosty, who owns a museum in Austin called Museum of the Weird, which has all kinds of Bigfoot stuff and two-headed pigs in jars and all kinds of mummies and things like that. Boosty had seen the Minnesota Iceman when he was a kid, like me, and also been impacted, and so he bought it. He bought the exhibit, the body, the sarcophagus, all the signage, for an undisclosed price. And I can tell you it was still very expensive, okay? But Steve Boosty bought it in 2013, decided to bring it down to the Museum of the Weird in Austin, Texas, which you can still be seen in Austin on 6th Street this very day. Oops, I'm sorry. Went up and down. Now, regrettably, in 2013, my friend Lyle Blackburn and I appeared on a terrible TV show called Shipping Wars, if anyone has ever seen this episode. And the plot for this particular TV show was that the Minnesota Iceman exhibit was going to be transported from Minnesota to Austin. And a young lady who was the truck driver, and the whole show is basically about people that drive trucks and ship weird things across the country, right? Well, the producers decided that they wanted to meet us in Fouke, Arkansas. So we actually met in Fouke on Boggy Creek. They pulled up, and the freezer had broken on the truck, so the ice had already melted out. But they pulled up, and you guys can go seek out this episode if you like, but it's a little silly. But Lyle and I and some other researchers basically took this young lady out into the woods of Boggy Creek. We left her alone in the dark, and then we went off and made weird Bigfoot noises and stuff to spook her. So it's kind of silly. It's regrettable, but we do what we got to do. But the bonus for me was that I was the first researcher that got to examine the Minnesota Iceman exhibit in decades. So I got to see it and examine it completely unfrozen, out of the ice, in the trailer, and I came to the determination that absolutely, without a doubt, this was the same thing that I saw in 1976 when I was 9 years old. Same teeth, same features, everything, it was the same. So I'm at least confident that whatever I saw when I was a kid back in 1976 is the same thing that is now on display at Museum of the Texas. We did a special presentation at Museum of the Weird shortly thereafter the episode was filmed. Several people came out. We unveiled the Minnesota Iceman exhibit. It was now once again frozen in a block of ice, where it is to this day. I've had an opportunity. Here's a picture of Steve Boosty at Museum of the Weird with the Minnesota Iceman exhibit. I was on another TV show in 2019 called, well, it was originally called In Search of Monsters, but I think they later changed the name to When Monsters Attack. And if any of you guys have ever seen that show, we did an episode called The Vietnam Rock Apes. And it was really, they had some Vietnam veterans that came in and talked about their rock ape sightings when they were on duty and fighting in the Vietnam War. And we also, I examined the Minnesota Iceman once again. Now, Steve was gracious enough to melt the ice down very, very low to the point where I could spend enough time to take very accurate measurements. And basically, I made a comprehensive list of all the things that have been observed and documented by Sanderson, Heuvelmans, and Terry Cullen based and against this new specimen. So I didn't find 11, but there are some things that are different. The new version of the Iceman, both of its eyes are in its orbits, in its sockets. It's not missing eyes. Its teeth are radically different from what, the dentition is radically different from what Heuvelmans and Sanderson described. The legs, some of the lengths of the legs that were measured and estimated by Heuvelmans and Sanderson did not exactly measure up with what I came up with, which some of that might be, you know, because it was in ice when they saw it, and I got a little bit of a better view than they did. Here's a very recent photo. I was up there last year. This is what the Minnesota Iceman exhibit looks like, at least its face. For the first time, I saw the broken bone on the top of the arm. I had never seen that before. And I saw the mold. Steve Boosty acquired the actual mold that was used by a guy named Howard Ball, the guy who actually created the latex version of the Minnesota Iceman, had a mold that he and his son used to pour the latex in and stuff. So that's where we're at. Subsequently, there may be other experts that are studying the Minnesota Iceman as well. We might move a little bit here. The Minnesota Iceman was very influential in terms of a movie that came out in the 1980s about a frozen caveman. Other stories that you guys have heard about frozen cavemen and creatures that have been thawed out of the ice. I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to leave it here, which is, after all these years of research, regrettably, I've come to the personal conclusion that the Minnesota Iceman probably was a hoax, and that there really was just one version that was a dummy. The only argument we have against that at this point is that Bernard Heuvelmans and Ivan Sanderson, the two founders of my field of cryptozoology, were fooled. Two trained scientists were somehow fooled. But I think if there was actual, and there's been a theory that there was actual dead flesh or something that was placed in with the Iceman, whether it was dead deer or meat, that created that bad smell that everyone came up with or sensed. And that basically Hansen was just a great showman, and he just was able to, you know, think about this. He kept changing his story constantly, okay? So he was a very shifty guy in terms of that. And the other thing that's very important is that the actual anatomy of the Minnesota Iceman does not match with a Bigfoot, does not match with any fossil hominin, whether it's a Neanderthal, a Homo erectus, an Australopithecine. The morphology of its hands, its whole body. In fact, Dr. John Napier, the primatologist, said it best. He said, the Minnesota Iceman displays the worst features of all the different types of hominins involved, and it makes no sense whatsoever in terms of evolution. So I think that's the main thing for me, is that its anatomy just doesn't line up with anything we know about hominins in the fossil record. So I think that, combined with the fact that it looks close enough to what Heuvelmans and Sanderson described in 1968, that I don't know, maybe it was modified or maybe something like that. So anyways, sadly, that's kind of the conclusion I've come to, that it probably is a hoax, but we can't rule it out completely. It is possible that somewhere, languishing in a secret grave somewhere, or maybe at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, is the body of something that could have proven that something like Bigfoot does exist. So anyways, that's where I'm at, guys. Appreciate your time. If you have any other questions or comments, please come see me at my table. Thank you so much. I forgot about the Yeti de Bergenoof, which was a French ripoff of the Minnesota Iceman. If you see these pictures online, it's fake. And another hoaxer, who I shall not name, also had a frozen Bigfoot in a block of ice. So, I mean, there have been many hoaxes that have kind of been derived from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Hey, another big hand for Ken here. Be up in a minute, so if you've got some, you'd like to go over to Ken's table and ask some questions, or look at the table.
Okay, you guys, that was Ken Gerhard at the Kiamichi. Okay, you guys, that was Ken Gerhard at the Kiamichi Mountains Bigfoot Conference. We're going to be ending this stream. We'll be restarting stream here in a little while, so make sure to come back and join us and check for when these streams start.